I'm Gabby, or Dr. Gabrielle Samuel, and I'm a lecturer in environmental justice and health based in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine in the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. I started at King's through a project that was called the LabTech project. So it was looking at emerging technologies and the translation of technologies from research to clinical practice. And I looked at a technology called it's brain scanning for people that are in a vegetative state. And I was exploring how the research gets portrayed in the media and comparing that to how that research was described in ethical literature, but also by families who were affected by the technology, and just showed how different the stories are depending on where you hear about it. So then it was just various jobs, Lancaster University, Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and here at King's until I got my permanent position. I focus on the ethical and social issues associated with the environmental impacts associated with digital technologies, and particularly digital health technologies and data-driven health research. So digital technologies have an environmental impact that most people don't normally think about. So we use words like, or metaphors like cloud and virtual, and it makes us think that it's kind of like really immaterial, but actually data has a real physicality. It's stored and processed in data centers, which have various wires and cables and networks and infrastructures that connect them to each other. And so the more we store data and the more we process data, the larger the environmental impact. And the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to digital technologies overall are roughly similar to the aviation industries. And then on top of that, there are environmental impacts that come from mining rare minerals that are used to produce the digital technologies, and also social impacts related to that in terms of whether the mining is regulated, whether it's using exploitative practices, whether it pays workers well, what kind of health hazards come from that. And then right at the end of life as well, e-waste. We go through our digital tech quite a lot. And a lot of that isn't recycled through regulatory pathways and ends up getting, this is very simplistic, but ends up getting dumped in lower to middle income countries in these huge electronic waste dumps, where communities kind of start to move in around those dumps because they can recycle the minerals within the waste for the livelihood. The problem is that they do this in an unregulated way, which causes a huge number of health hazards to both themselves, but also to their families and children, which is just incredibly traumatic. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, has written a report about the damaging effects of a lot of these e-waste dumps on the health conditions of children as well as pregnant women, and also those that do the scavenging. So my journey is quite long. It started when I did a PhD in molecular genetics many moons ago in Australia, and then I postdoced for a few years in molecular genetics, realized that lab work was not for me at all, so did a master's in bioethics. And then finishing my master's, I moved into doing some work experience in a centre called the Centre for Values, Ethics and the Law in Medicine, because there weren't very many jobs at the time, and so that was the only way to kind of get my foot through the door. So I worked there on emerging technologies and the ethical and social issues associated with them, mainly around genetics and synthetic biology, because it went with my background, but also in biobanking and cord blood banking. I was there for 5 years, slowly kind of moving through the ranks, which was just probably one of the best times in my academic life, I think, because that's where I did so much learning in social sciences and really had to kind of change the way I thought. And I learned about writing papers in the social sciences, and I learned about empirical bioethics, which is when you use methods like interviews and focus groups and surveys to kind of help you through your ethical journey. But when I came back to London a few years later and I looked for a job, I couldn't find one because I didn't have a PhD in social science. So I was lucky enough to be offered a Wellcome PhD, and I conducted my PhD in medical sociology and finished that. And then from there, I've just been kind of moving more and more into the social sciences and sociology, building, I suppose, my abilities to conduct social science research and also think more theoretically about social science issues. I suppose, I've always been interested in ethical and social issues related to emerging technologies, and particularly around genetics. And as genetics kind of became more data intensive, it moved to genomics, which then kind of moved my interest into kind of like health data more broadly, and then kind of like AI. So that's that continuity. But then When I first started looking at ethical and social issues, they were very often around issues of that affected individuals. So consent might be a really obvious one, related to patient or participant autonomy. Privacy is another one that's sometimes constructed as something that's a very individual ethical issue. As time progressed, these concepts weren't really, and I'm not the only person that said this, many scholars kind of have pointed this out, they can't do the work that we need to do as we think about these technologies, because these technologies have broader effects on society. So we need to think about other ethical concepts that are more useful. So that kind of drew me to more sociological concepts associated with maybe power and questions around value trade-offs, trust, trustworthiness, these types of issues to help us kind of think about how these technologies can come into society and how they kind of work there. And then I suppose the next step is from going individual to community and society to then move to the environmental impacts. So it's not just thinking about how communities are affected by these technologies, but also how these technologies are manufactured at the beginning and then at the end disposed of or recycled at the end, how a community is there kind of mapping out and how the environment's infected. So it's kind of, I suppose, individual, community, and expanding that my moral gaze over time. There's a lot of work in social theory around the responsibilization of the individual and how that relates to kind of like neoliberal societies. And so I want to do some work around thinking about that, and I want to do some work around environmental justice and responsibility, because we talk so much about environmental justice because it comes from like a bottom-up advocacy movement. That's where the term comes from. It always often ends up on the individual, but that's really problematic because my interviews have shown that we don't always have the ability to respond. So and that comes from a scholar called Donna Haraway that says, how can you be responsible if you don't have the ability to respond? And so I think there's a lot of issues that we can kind of unpack and start to explore. What does the future look like for me? I don't know. All I can say is that it's been my goal to get a permanent position, and I'm nearly half a century old and I finally got it. So I'm really excited, like from going from, changing disciplines from life sciences to bioethics to medical sociology to now kind of health sociology, and like contracts and contracts and contracts. To have a permanent position is like amazing, and in a really fantastic department that's interdisciplinary and so accepting of people that have those backgrounds is just brilliant.